The radiator in room 4B had a peculiar habit of rhythmic clicking, a metallic heartbeat that seemed far more interested in the passage of time than Mr. Henderson was in the quadratic formula. I sat in the very last row, right by the window where the glass was perpetually smudged by the foreheads of generations of dreamers who had come before me. Outside, the Somerset countryside rolled away in a blur of bruised greens and muddy browns, but today, the sun was doing something quite extraordinary. It was slicing through the grey clouds like a hot knife through butter, turning the puddles on the netball court into shimmering patches of fallen sky. I leaned my chin on my palm, my pen hovering listlessly over a notebook that contained exactly 3 things: a very detailed drawing of a penguin wearing a top hat, a grocery list consisting entirely of Jaffa cakes, and the word mathematics written in such aggressive cursive that it looked like a cry for help. Finley, Mr. Henderson's voice droned, a sound like a distant lawn mower. Perhaps you could grace us with the value of X. I blinked, pulling my gaze away from a particularly ambitious pigeon on the windowsill. To be honest, sir, I think X is having a bit of an identity crisis. It's always looking for itself, isn't it? Maybe we should stop pressuring it, and let it find its own path in life. It's very 21st century, self-discovery and all that. A few people sniggered. Sienna, sitting 2 desks to my left, buried her face in her hoodie to hide a grin. Mr. Henderson sighed, the sound of a man who had long ago accepted that some souls were simply not destined for the heights of trigonometry. See me after class, Finley. Or don't. At this point, your absence might actually improve the national average. I didn't take it to heart. I couldn't. Life is far too short to be upset by men in beige corduroy, who think life's greatest mysteries can be solved with a Casio calculator. Besides, I had bigger things on my mind. Specifically, how many custard creams I could reasonably consume during break without feeling a profound sense of existential dread. When the bell finally shrieked, a sound like a banshee with a stubbed toe, I shoved my chaotic mess of papers into my bag and drifted toward the door. Sienna caught up with me in the corridor, her Doc Martens clattering against the linoleum. "You're going to fail, you know," she said, though her tone was more affectionate than accusatory. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled packet of crisps, offering me one. "You can't just philosophy your way out of GCSEs, Finn." "I'm not trying to philosophy my way out," I said, crunching on a salt and vinegar swirl. "I'm merely pointing out that the education system is designed to turn us into efficient little cogs, and I, for one, would rather be a slightly decorative, somewhat useless ornamental screw. It has more character." Sienna laughed, shoving me gently toward the courtyard. "You're a Muppet. But you're my favorite Muppet. Come on, let's go to our spot before the Year 7s colonize it." Our spot was a weathered wooden bench tucked behind the drama block, shaded by a massive, ancient oak tree that looked like it had seen several world wars and at least 3 different eras of school uniform scandals. We sat there, the weak British sun warming our knees, and for a moment, the weight of looming exams and the terrifying uncertainty of the future felt like a distant rumor. "Do you ever feel like we're just waiting?" Sienna asked suddenly, her legs swinging. She was usually the bubbly one, the girl who could talk a brick wall into a spirited debate about indie music, but today her eyes were fixed on the horizon. "Waiting for life to start. Like everything we're doing now is just the boring intro credits of a film we haven't even seen yet." I leaned back, looking up through the tangled branches of the oak. "I think that's the mistake, Senator. We think life is the big stuff. The university degree, the wedding, the promotion. But what if life is actually just the bit where we're sitting on a slightly damp bench, eating dodgy crisps, and complaining about Mr. Henderson? What if the intro credits are the film? And we're just waiting for a climax that never comes, because we're already living it. Sienna looked at me, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. That's actually quite deep, Finn. For someone who forgot his PE kit for the 4th time this month. I didn't forget it. I corrected her with dignity. I staged a peaceful protest against the tyranny of short shorts. It's a matter of principle. The truth was, I wasn't just a slacker. I was a person who felt everything a little too loudly. The world was too big, too bright, and too demanding. I struggled with the schedules, the deadlines, and the way people expected you to know what you wanted to be at 16. How was I supposed to choose a career path when I hadn't even decided if I liked olives yet? Currently, it was a no, but I was open to further testing. But there was a resilience in that, too. A quiet, stubborn refusal to be crushed by the should-haves. I had spent most of my school life being told I was underachieving, but I felt like I was achieving a great deal in the field of noticing things. I noticed the way the light changed from gold to violet at 4 p.m. in the library. I noticed that Mrs. Gable, the stern receptionist, always wore mismatched socks when she was having a stressful day. I noticed that Sienna always bit her lip when she was worried about her mum's health, even when she was making jokes. My mum's back in the hospital, Sienna said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Just for tests. But the house feels really quiet, you know. Like the walls are leaning in. I shifted closer, our shoulders touching. I didn't have a grand philosophical answer for that. I didn't have a quote from a Greek thinker, or a motivational poster. That sucks, Senator Properly Rubbish. Do you want to come over after school? My mum's making that shepherd's pie that tastes vaguely like cardboard, but in a comforting, nostalgic way. And we can watch that terrible reality show about people who build houses out of recycled yogurt pots. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I'd like that. Thanks, Finn. We sat in silence for a while, watching a ladybird navigate the treacherous landscape of my backpack. It's a funny thing, really. We're taught that strength is about shouting, about winning, about being the best. But I think strength is more like that ladybird. It's about keeping your footing when the world is shaking, and having the courage to keep moving even if you're not entirely sure which way is north. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of boredom and minor triumphs. I managed to not fall asleep in history, and I even contributed an idea to our group project on the Industrial Revolution. I suggested that if they'd had more naps back then, they might have been less inclined to build smog-belching factories. As I walked home later that evening, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Oak Haven was a quiet town, the kind of place where nothing much happened, but everything felt significant if you looked at it long enough. I stopped by the bridge over the stream, watching the water swirl around the mossy stones. I thought about my dad, who had left when I was 7, leaving behind nothing but a collection of old jazz records and a vague sense of inadequacy that I'd spent years trying to shake off. He was a man of potential, who never quite figured out how to use it. For a long time, I'd been terrified I was just like him, a dreamer with no anchor. But then I looked at my reflection in the water. I didn't see a failure. I saw a boy who was trying. A boy who found beauty in the mundane, and who could make his best friend laugh when her world was falling apart. Maybe that was enough. Maybe being a Muppet was actually a noble calling. The next morning, I arrived at school with a renewed sense of purpose. Or, at least, I'd remembered to bring a pen that actually had ink in it. Progress is a slow climb. I found Sienna by the lockers. She looked tired, but she had a fierce spark in her eyes. I've decided, she said, slamming her locker shut. I'm going to apply for that summer internship at the Botanical Gardens. Even if my grades are rubbish. Even if they think I'm just some kid from a comprehensive with messy hair. I grinned, leaning against the cold metal. That's the spirit. And if they don't take you, we'll just start our own garden. With blackjack. And better snacks. You're an idiot, she said, but she was beaming. We headed toward the English block, where we had a double period of Shakespeare. Most people hated it, but I didn't mind. Shakespeare knew what he was doing. He understood that humans are essentially ridiculous creatures who fall in love with the wrong people, make terrible decisions, and talk to ghosts when things get stressful. He was the original back-of-the-class dreamer. As I sat down, I noticed a small patch of sunlight landing directly on my desk. It felt like a spotlight. I took out my notebook, the one with the penguin, and turned to a fresh page. I didn't write about X, or the Industrial Revolution. I wrote a single sentence, right at the top. The sun doesn't ask for permission to shine, and neither should I. It was a bit cheesy. It was definitely the kind of thing a pseudo-philosopher would say. But as I looked over at Sienna, who was currently trying to see how many pencils she could stick into her hair, I realized that we were doing all right. We were messy, we were confused, and we were probably going to fail our mock exams, but we were alive. And in a universe that is mostly cold, dead space, being a warm, living, slightly stupid human is a pretty spectacular achievement. Finn, Sienna whispered, leaning over. Look. I've got 6. She had, indeed, managed to wedge 6 pencils into her messy bun. Impressive, I whispered back. But can you do 7? Challenge accepted. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat at the front of the room. Finley. Sienna. Unless you are currently discussing the tragic downfall of Macbeth, I suggest you cease your whispered consultations. I looked at Mr. Henderson, then at the sunlight on my desk, then at Sienna's pencil-filled hair. Actually, sir, I said, a cheeky glint in my eye, we were just discussing the inherent absurdity of the human condition as reflected in the pursuit of trivial goals. Macbeth would have understood. He was quite big on the whole life is a tale told by an idiot thing. Mr. Henderson stared at me for a long beat. For a second, I thought I'd finally pushed him too far. Then, to my absolute shock, the corner of his mouth twitched. Sit down, Finley. And for heaven's sake, someone give that boy a proper book to read. I sat down, feeling a strange, bubbling warmth in my chest. It wasn't just the sun. It was the realization that even in the most rigid systems, there's room for a bit of light to leak through. The summer was coming. I could feel it in the air, a promise of long afternoons and the smell of mown grass. There would be more exams, more hospital visits for Sienna's mum, more days where I felt like I was drowning in a sea of expectations. But there would also be more laughter, more salt and vinegar crisps, and more moments where the world felt like it was made just for us. I picked up my pen and began to write. Not because I had to, but because I had something to say. I wrote about the clicking radiator, the ambitious pigeon, and the way the light looks when it's caught in the eyes of someone who's decided not to give up. I realized then that life isn't about getting everything right. It's about being brave enough to get things spectacularly wrong, and still showing up the next day to see what happens. It's about being the kid at the back of the class who sees the world not as a series of problems to be solved, but as a story to be told. As the bell rang for the end of the day, I didn't rush out. I took my time, packing my things carefully. I walked out into the corridor, joining the sea of students, each with their own secret burdens and hidden joys. I felt a sense of kinship with all of them, the overachievers, the athletes, the quiet ones, and even the ones who, like me, were just trying to figure out how to be. Sienna was waiting for me at the gates. Ready? She asked. Ready, I said. We walked out of the school gates, and into the afternoon light. The hills were glowing, the birds were singing, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like an open door. "Hey, Finn," Sienna said as we turned the corner toward the park. "Yeah. I think you're right. About the intro credits." I smiled, shielding my eyes against the glare. "I usually am. It's a gift and a curse." "Shut up," she laughed, and we kept walking, two small figures against the vast, golden canvas of a Somerset afternoon, perfectly content to be exactly who we were. A little bit lost, a little bit silly, and entirely, wonderfully okay. The years ahead would bring their own storms, of course. There would be heartbreaks that felt like the end of the world and failures that bit like winter frost. But I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that as long as there was a bit of sun and a friend to share a bag of crisps with, we'd find a way through. Because that's the thing about being a dreamer. You don't need a map when you're used to navigating by the stars. And even when the clouds come, you know the stars are still there, waiting for the sky to clear. I looked up one last time, before we reached my house. The sky was a deep, impossible blue, and for a moment, I felt like I could reach up and touch it. I didn't, of course. I'd probably have tripped over my own feet, and dropped my bag. But the fact that I felt I could, that was the important part. "See you tomorrow, Finn," Sienna called out as she headed toward her own street. "See you tomorrow, Sen," I shouted back. I walked up my driveway, pushed open the front door, and was immediately hit by the scent of Mum's cardboard shepherd's pie. It was the best smell in the world. I dropped my bag in the hall, ignored the pile of revision guides on the table, and went into the kitchen. "How was school?" Mum asked, not looking up from the oven. "It was all right," I said, grabbing a fork. "I think I learned something today." "Oh? What's that?" I looked out the kitchen window at the last sliver of sun disappearing behind the trees. "I learned that X doesn't matter as much as now. Mum paused, giving me that look, the one that was half puzzled, half proud. "That sounds very deep, Finley. Now, wash your hands and help me with the peas." I smiled. The philosophy could wait. The shepherd's pie was ready, the cat was purring against my leg, and for this moment, everything was exactly where it needed to be. The sun had set, but the warmth remained, tucked away in the corners of the house and the quiet spaces of my heart, ready to light up the morning when it inevitably came. And that, I decided, was more than enough. It was everything. The radiator in my bedroom had a personality. It wasn't a good one. It was a temperamental, clanking beast that sounded like a Victorian ghost trying to escape a copper pipe. As I sat at my desk that evening, the cardboard shepherd's pie settling in my stomach like a warm, heavy brick, I stared at my biology textbook. Or rather, I stared at a diagram of a mitochondria, which someone, likely aboard year 10 with a Sharpie, had turned into a tiny, disgruntled potato wearing a top hat. I felt a sudden, profound kinship with that potato. We were both just trying to generate energy in a system that seemed designed to drain it. "Finley, have you started your revision yet?" Mum's voice drifted up the stairs, carrying that specific parental frequency that could penetrate solid oak and noise-canceling headphones. "I'm in the zone, Mum," I shouted back, leaning over the desk so my shadow looked more studious against the wall. The zone was actually a very specific mental space, where I wondered if spiders ever got embarrassed when they tripped over their own legs. I mean, they have 8 of them. The margin for error is astronomical. I picked up my highlighter, neon yellow, the color of false hope, and hovered it over a paragraph about ATP. If life were a film, this would be the montage where the music swells, the pages flip rapidly, and I emerge as a genius. In reality, I spent 10 minutes trying to balance a pencil on my nose. I was failing at the montage. I was the outtake. I was the bit of footage the editor cuts, because it's too depressing to show the protagonist eating a single cold pea off his desk while staring blankly at a wall. I sighed and looked out of the window. The Somerset night was thick and velvety, the kind of dark that feels like it's hugging the house. Somewhere out there, Sienna was probably actually studying. She had this way of making productivity look like an art form, whereas I made it look like a crime scene. My phone buzzed. It was a text from her. Sienna, just found a moth in my wardrobe. I've named him Barnaby. He seems very judged by my choice of knitwear. I grinned, the weight of the mitochondria potato lifting slightly. Me? Tell Barnaby that fashion is subjective. Also, are you actually doing the biology practice questions? Or are you just talking to insects? Sienna, I did 3 questions. Then I realized that the cell wall is just a metaphor for our own emotional boundaries. Now I'm eating a digestive biscuit and staring at the moon. It's a whole vibe, Finn. I leaned back, the chair creaking ominously. That was the thing about us. We were both experts in the art of the deeply meaningful distraction. While the rest of our year was stressing about predicted grades and university applications, we were busy naming moths and finding metaphors in baked goods. It felt like we were standing on the edge of a very fast-moving river, and instead of trying to swim against the current, we were just sitting on the bank, throwing pebbles and wondering where the water came from. The next morning, the world was wrapped in a damp, grey mist that smelled of wet tarmac and wood smoke. It was the kind of morning that makes you want to crawl back under the duvet and stay there until the next decade. But the school bus waits for no dreamer, especially not one who still can't find his left trainer. Finn. The bus is at the end of the lane. Mum called out, her voice now reaching the emergency register. I scrambled, shoving my half-finished essay into my bag along with a slightly squashed banana. I found my trainer under the sofa, don't ask, and sprinted out the door, my coat flapping behind me like a depressed cape. I made it to the bus just as the doors were hissing shut. The driver, a man named Terry whose facial expression had been set to disgruntled since 1984, gave me a look that suggested I was personally responsible for the decline of the British Empire. Cutting it fine, aren't we, Shakespeare? He grumbled. Character building, Terry, I panted, stumbling down the aisle. Adds tension to the narrative. Sienna was in our usual seat at the back, her knees pulled up to her chest, her headphones around her neck. She looked like she'd been through a minor hurricane. Her hair was a chaotic halo of frizz, and she had a smudge of ink on her cheek. Rough start? I asked, sliding into the seat beside her. I forgot we had a vocab test in French, she whispered, her eyes wide with the sort of terror usually reserved for horror movies. I spent the whole morning trying to remember the word for stapler. It's agrafuse, Finn. Why do I need to know that? When am I ever going to be in a high-stakes situation in Paris where I desperately need to bind 2 pieces of paper together? Maybe you'll be a spy, I suggested, pulling out my squashed banana. And the secret plans are falling apart, and the only way to save the world is to ask the waiter for an agrafuse. She let out a small, huffing laugh. You're an idiot. I prefer creative thinker. The bus lurched forward, winding through the narrow Somerset lanes. We passed stone cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys and fields where sheep stood like damp, fluffy statues in the fog. It was beautiful in a quiet, lonely way. Do you ever feel like we're just waiting? Sienna asked suddenly, her voice dropping. She was tracing a pattern in the condensation on the window. Waiting for what? Everything. For school to end. For life to start. for someone to tell us what we're supposed to be doing. It feels like we're in the lobby of a very long, very boring play, and the curtain is never going to go up. I looked at the S she had traced on the glass. I think the play is already happening, Senator, it's just that we're the ones in the background scenes. You know, the people in the cafe who don't have any lines, but are having a really intense conversation about a stapler. She turned to look at me, a small smile playing on her lips. I like that. The background people are always more interesting anyway. They don't have to follow the plot. Exactly. We can just eat our bananas and watch the leads stress out over their dramatic monologues. The school gates loomed ahead, a grey fortress of education and questionable lunches. As we filed off the bus, the air was filled with the usual morning cacophony, the shouting of Year 7s who seemed to possess infinite energy, the clatter of lockers, and the distant, mournful sound of the first bell. First period was geography with Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson was a man who loved rocks more than he loved people. He spoke about igneous formations with a passion that was genuinely unsettling. The tectonic plates, he said, tapping a map with a wooden pointer that looked like it had been carved from a tree he'd personally befriended, are constantly shifting. They move at the same rate your fingernails grow. You don't feel it, but beneath your feet. The world is tearing itself apart, and putting itself back together. I leaned my head on my hand, watching a fly buzz against the window pane. The world is tearing itself apart, and putting itself back together. That felt a lot more relatable than the French word for stapler. I felt like my own tectonic plates were shifting. One day I was a kid who just wanted to play football and eat sweets. The next, I was this person who had to have aspirations and career goals. I opened my notebook, but instead of drawing a diagram of a subduction zone, I wrote, I am moving at the speed of a fingernail. Sienna, sitting 3 desks away, caught my eye. She mimed yawning, then pointed to her own notebook. She'd drawn a picture of Mr. Henderson as a giant rock with a mustache. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The day dragged on in a blur of beige corridors and the smell of floor wax. By the time lunch arrived, the mist had cleared, leaving behind a crisp, cold sun that made the puddles in the quad sparkle. We sat on our usual bench, the one with the wobbly leg near the art block. Sienna was picking the crusts off her sandwich, looking thoughtful. I think I'm going to fail art, she said matter-of-factly. Don't be daft. Your stuff is brilliant. That portrait you did of the old man at the bus stop. That was incredible. It's not about the work, Finn. It's about the why. Mrs. Gable asked me what my artistic statement was. I told her I just liked the way the light hit his nose. Apparently, that's not enough. I need to be exploring the fragility of the human condition, or some rubbish. I took a bite of an apple. Tell her the light on the nose is the fragility of the human condition. If his nose wasn't fragile, the light wouldn't look so nice on it. Or something. She laughed, throwing a bit of crust at a pigeon. You should be an art critic. You're very good at making nonsense sound profound. It's a survival mechanism, I said. If you talk fast enough and use words like juxtaposition and visceral, people assume you know what you're doing. It's how I've survived English literature for 4 years. I just want to do things because they're beautiful, she said softly, looking at the way the sun was hitting the brickwork of the old gym. Why does everything have to have a reason? Why can't a drawing just be a drawing? Why can't we just be us? Because the world is obsessed with labels, I said, feeling that pseudo-philosophical itch again. If they can label us, they can file us away. The artist, the dreamer, the one who is good at maths. It makes them feel safe. But they don't realize that labels are just stickers. And stickers peel off. Finn, That was almost too deep. Are you okay? Do you need a Kit Kat? I might need to, I admitted. We spent the rest of lunch talking about nothing and everything. We talked about the weirdness of milk, the possibility of time travel being invented by a cat, and whether or not our PE teacher, Mr. Grigg, was actually a robot programmed only to say the word stamina. It was these moments, the small, silly, inconsequential ones, that felt the most real. The classroom felt like a waiting room, but the bench by the art block felt like home. In the afternoon, we had double science. The lab always smelled of gas and broken dreams. We were doing an experiment involving Bunsen burners and copper sulfate. There's something mesmerizing about a blue flame. It's so steady, so focused. I watched the blue crystals dissolve in the water, turning it into a brilliant, electric azure. It's like a potion, I whispered to Sienna, who was carefully measuring out the liquid. Don't drink it, she warned. Unless you want your artistic statement to be death by chemistry. It would be a very colorful way to go. As I stirred the beaker, I thought about what Mr. Henderson had said about the tectonic plates. Maybe that was what school was. A giant lab where they were trying to see which of us would dissolve, which of us would crystallize, and which of us would just blow up. I looked around the room. There was Leo, the boy who was always top of the class, sweating over his notes as if his life depended on the exact temperature of the water. There was Maya, who was staring out the window, her mind clearly miles away. And there were we, two kids in safety goggles, finding magic in a beaker of blue water. I realized then that I didn't want to be the one who got everything right. I didn't want to be the perfect crystal. I wanted to be the reaction. I wanted to be the thing that changed, the thing that sizzled and turned into something unexpected. When the final bell finally rang, it felt like a prison break. We spilled out into the afternoon air, the sun now low in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the playing fields. Walk the long way? Sienna asked. Always. The long way took us past the old canal, where the water was still and green, reflecting the overhanging willow trees. We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our shoes. I think I've decided something, Sienna said as we reached the bridge. Yeah. I'm not going to write an artistic statement. I'm just going to give Mrs. Gable a mirror, and tell her to look at her own nose. See if she can find the fragility in that. I laughed, the sound echoing under the bridge. Bold move. I'll prepare your bail money. And what about you, Finn? What's your Finley statement? I looked at the water, watching a single leaf float downstream. It was spinning slowly, caught in a tiny eddy, but it was still moving. My statement is: I am currently under construction. Please excuse the mess, but the view is quite nice if you stand in the right spot. She nudged my shoulder with hers. I think that's the best one yet. We reached the point where our paths diverged. The sky was turning a bruised purple, the first stars beginning to blink through the haze. See you tomorrow, Finn, she said, her voice soft in the twilight. See you tomorrow, Sen. I watched her walk away, until she was just a dark shape against the hedges. I felt a strange sense of peace. The homework was still there, the exams were still coming, and I still didn't know what I was doing with my life. But as I walked the rest of the way home, I didn't feel like I was drowning anymore. I felt like I was floating. I got back to the house, and the smell of roasting chicken met me at the door. Mum was in the kitchen, humming along to the radio. Better day today? She asked, glancing at me. Yeah, I said, dropping my bag. I learned about tectonic plates and blue fire. Sounds productive. It was, I said, grabbing a carrot from the chopping board. I think I'm starting to move. Oh? Where to? I looked out the window at the darkening Somerset Hills. Nowhere yet. Just forward. At the speed of a fingernail. Mum paused, her knife hovering over a potato. She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled, a real, knowing smile. Well, as long as you're moving, Finn. That's all that matters. I went upstairs and sat at my desk. I didn't open my biology book. Instead, I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I didn't write about ATP or mitochondria. I wrote about the way the light looks on a nose. I wrote about Barnaby the moth and the secret life of staplers. I wrote about the background people and the beauty of being unfinished. I wrote until my hand ached and the moon was high in the sky. It wasn't an essay, and it wasn't a revision note. It was a map of where I was right then. And for the first time, I didn't feel lost. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, in the middle of a story that was just beginning to get interesting. The radiator clanked, a rhythmic, steady beat. It sounded less like a ghost now and more like a heart. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and listened to the house breathe. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more stress, and probably another squashed banana. But tonight, the world was quiet, the stars were out, and I was moving. Slowly, steadily, and entirely on my own terms. The next morning, the sun decided to make a proper appearance. It wasn't the weak, watery sun of the previous day, but a bold, golden light that made the frost on the grass look like scattered diamonds. I didn't even have to be shouted at to get out of bed. I felt a strange, buzzing energy, like a battery that had finally been plugged into the right socket. I found my other trainer. It was in the biscuit tin. Don't ask. I have a very confusing life, and headed out. The bus journey was different today. Terry the driver actually nodded at me. Morning, Shakespeare. Not running today. Saving my stamina for the big scenes, Terry, I joked, tapping my temple. Sienna was already in the seat, looking remarkably put together. She was wearing a bright yellow scarf that made her look like a stray sunbeam. I did it, she whispered as I sat down. Did what? Found Barnaby a wife. No. I told Mrs. Gable. About the nose. I leaned in, intrigued. And? She stared at me for a full minute. I thought she was going to explode. But then she just sighed, sat down, and said, finally, some honesty. She gave me an A for the week. I stared at her. You're kidding. Nope. I think we've been overthinking it, Finn. All this time, we've been trying to speak their language. We should have just been speaking ours. Our language is mostly nonsense and crisp reviews. Senator, I'm not sure the exam board is ready for that. Maybe not. But I am. She looked out at the passing fields, her eyes bright. I'm going to paint the canal today. Not as a metaphor for the passage of time, but just because the water is green and I like green. I'll come with you, I said. I can be the guy in the background, who is having an intense conversation with a duck. Perfect. The school day passed in a weird, heightened reality. In history, we learned about the Great Fire of London, and I found myself thinking about how much of life is just rebuilding after things burn down. In maths, the numbers actually stayed still on the page for once, as if they'd finally decided to cooperate. During break, we stood by the fence, watching the Year 11s play a chaotic game of football. Do you ever think about where we'll be in 10 years? Sienna asked, leaning her chin on her hands. I'll probably still be looking for my trainers, I said. Seriously, Finn? I looked at her. Her yellow scarf was fluttering in the breeze. I don't know. Maybe I'll be a writer. Or a philosopher who only works in cafes. Or maybe I'll just be a guy who's really good at appreciating the light on people's noses. I think you'll be all of them, she said firmly. And I'll be the one painting the covers of your books. Deal. We shook on it, a solemn, ridiculous handshake that involved a lot of finger wiggling. As the afternoon light began to fade, we headed to the canal. Sienna set up her easel, her movements sure and steady. I sat on the grass nearby, my notebook open on my lap. The water was indeed very green. It was the color of secrets and old stories. I watched as she dipped her brush into the paint, the first stroke a bold, vibrant line across the canvas. I started to write. Not because I had to, but because the words were there, bubbling up like the blue fire in the science lab. We are the background people, I wrote. We are the ones who notice the things the leads miss. We see the way the moss grows on the bricks, the way the water ripples when a leaf hits it, the way the world keeps turning even when we're standing still. We don't need a script. We don't need a spotlight. We have the sun, and we have the green water, and we have each other. And that is a story worth telling. I looked up. Sienna was lost in her work, her face scrunched in concentration. A stray streak of green paint was on her forehead, but she didn't notice. She looked beautiful. Not film star beautiful, but real beautiful, the kind that comes from being exactly where you want to be, doing exactly what you want to do. I realized then that this was it. This was the now I'd been looking for. It wasn't a big, dramatic moment. It was just a girl, a boy, a canal, and a lot of green paint. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, golden glow over the Somerset landscape, I knew that whatever the future held, whatever exams, failures, or heartbreaks were waiting for us, would be okay. Because we weren't just waiting for the play to start. We were writing our own. And so far, the reviews were excellent. I looked at my notebook, then at Sienna, then at the fading light. Hey, Sen. Yeah. She said, not looking up from her canvas. I think the Finley statement needs an update. She paused, brush in mid-air. Oh? What is it now? I smiled, the cool evening air fresh on my face. Construction finished. Open for business. View is spectacular. She laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to hang in the air like music. I'll drink to that, she said, reaching for her water bottle. To the view, Finn. To the view, I echoed. And there, by the green water of the canal, under the watchful eyes of the Somerset stars, we Saturday. Two small figures in a vast, complicated world, perfectly content to be exactly who we were. Lost, silly, and entirely, wonderfully okay. The Tuesday morning that followed was a damp, grey reminder that the universe doesn't always care about your artistic epiphanies. The Somerset mist had rolled in thick and heavy, smelling of wet wool and diesel fumes from the school bus. I sat in the back row, my forehead pressed against the vibrating window, watching the hedgerows blur into a smear of dull charcoal. My brain felt like a browser with 47 tabs open, and 46 of them were just the sound of Sienna laughing by the canal. The last tab was a low battery warning for my impending double physics mock exam. Finn, you look like a Victorian orphan pondering the Industrial Revolution, Sienna said, sliding into the seat beside me. She was wearing a jumper that was several sizes too large, the sleeves swallowed her hands entirely. I'm practicing my brooding intellectual face, I muttered, not moving. It's for my future career as a man who stands on cliffs in the rain. Very lucrative. High demand in the moody postcard industry. You'll need more stubble, she noted, opening her bag to reveal a slightly squashed thermos. And perhaps a more tragic backstory than just forgetting to do your magnetism revision. The magnetism is the tragedy. Senator, I don't understand why the poles have to be so confrontational. Why can't they just agree to disagree? The world is already divided enough, without the subatomic particles joining in. She handed me the thermos. It smelled of cheap peppermint tea and hope. Drink. It'll help you harmonize with the electrons. We spent the journey in a comfortable sort of silence, the kind you only have with someone who knows exactly how much you hate 8:30 a.m. Occasionally, I'd look at her and see her sketching something in the margins of her planner, not a diagram of a circuit, but a series of tiny, intricate birds that looked like they were trying to fly off the page. School, when we arrived, was its usual chaotic self. The corridors were a frantic river of Year 7s, who seemed to be getting smaller every week, and Year 13s, who looked like they hadn't slept since 2019. I drifted through the morning like a ghost in a cheap blazer. In physics, Mr. Harrison was explaining something about gravitational fields. I tried to listen, I really did, but my mind kept wandering to the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of light near the projector. Mr. Thorne, Harrison's voice cut through my reverie. Would you care to explain the relationship between mass and attraction in this context? I blinked, my eyes refocusing on the whiteboard. Well, sir, I said, leaning back with a look of profound, entirely fake wisdom. I think it's a lot like human relationships. Some people have a huge presence, right? A massive mass. And you just find yourself orbiting them, even if you didn't mean to. You don't even need a reason. It's just physics. The class went silent. A few people snickered. Mr. Harrison stared at me for a long beat, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. That was remarkably poetic, Finley, he said dryly. And also entirely useless for the exam. 0 marks for the soul, 10 out of 10 for the waffle. Now, can someone give me the actual formula? Sienna kicked my ankle under the desk, her face hidden behind her textbook, but I could see her shoulders shaking with silent laughter. At lunch, we retreated to our usual spot behind the bike sheds, the unofficial headquarters of the people who are just doing their best club. We shared a packet of slightly stale digestive biscuits. You're becoming a legend, you know, Sienna said, dunking a biscuit into her tea. The Waffle King of Year 12. It's a prestigious title. I prefer spontaneous philosopher, I said, catching a crumb before it hit my tie. I'm just trying to make the curriculum more relatable. Formulas are cold, Senator, they don't have feelings. If I'm going to fail, I want to fail with style. You're not going to fail, she said, her tone suddenly serious. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the grey sky. You're too smart to fail. You just think too much about the bits that don't matter to the exam board. That's the problem, isn't it? The exam board doesn't care about the way the light hits the canal. They want to know the refractive index of the water. But the refractive index doesn't make you feel anything. It doesn't make you want to stay there forever. Sienna leaned her head against the brick wall. Maybe that's why we're the background people, Finn. Because we're the only ones looking at the light, while everyone else is measuring the angles. I looked at the biscuits, then at her. I think I'm okay with that. Being a background person, I mean. It's less pressure. If you're the lead, you have to have a character arc and a climactic showdown. If you're in the background, you can just eat biscuits and talk about gravity. Exactly, she smiled. And besides, the leads usually end up miserable by the end of the second act. We're still here. We sat there as the bell rang, a shrill, demanding sound that signaled the start of the afternoon slump. Neither of us moved for a moment. Finn. Yeah. Do you think the dust motes know they're in physics class? Or do they just think they're dancing? I stood up, brushing the crumbs off my trousers. I think they're the stars of the show, Senator, and honestly, I'm not going to be the one to tell them otherwise. We walked back into the main building, two small, optimistic specks in the grand, messy architecture of sixth form life. I still didn't know the formula for gravitational attraction, but as I walked beside Sienna, I felt like I understood the concept perfectly well. The afternoon was a blur of sociology, and a double period of English literature, where we discussed The Great Gatsby. The teacher kept talking about the green light, as a symbol of unattainable dreams. I looked at Sienna, who was busy doodling a very small, very round cat on the cover of her notebook, and I thought about our green water at the canal. Her dream wasn't unattainable. It was right there, in the way she held a brush, in the way she didn't care if she had paint on her face. And maybe mine wasn't either. Maybe being a writer wasn't about being famous, or having a bestseller. Maybe it was just about capturing these weird, small moments before they evaporated. As school ended and the sea of uniforms poured out of the gates, we found ourselves walking towards the bus stop again. The mist had cleared, leaving the air crisp and smelling of damp earth. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, her hand on the bus rail. "Same time," I agreed. "I'll bring better biscuits next time. Something with chocolate. We deserve it for surviving the gravitational pull of Mr. Harrison." She laughed, that same music box sound that made the grey pavement feel like a red carpet. "Deal. See you, Finn. See you, Sen." I watched the bus pull away, her face a pale oval in the window, waving until she disappeared around the corner. I started the long walk home, my bag heavy with books I probably wouldn't open, but my heart feeling curiously light. The Somerset stars were starting to peek through the clouds, tiny pinpricks of light that didn't care about my marks or my future, or the fact that I'd spent 40 minutes thinking about a toasted sandwich. I pulled my notebook out as I walked, the ink of my pen flowing easily in the dim light of the street lamps. Entry 42, I wrote. "Today I learned that gravity isn't just a law of physics. It's the way the world tries to pull you down, and the way you choose to stay afloat anyway. Also, digestive biscuits are better when they are shared." The Finley statement remains unchanged. The view is still spectacular, even when it's raining. I tucked the pen behind my ear and kept walking, a background character in a very big world, perfectly happy with my role. The script was still being written, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the ending. I was just enjoying the scene. The radiator in the sixth form common room was making a noise like a dying bagpipe, a wheezing, rhythmic clanking that seemed to synchronize perfectly with the ticking of the oversized clock above the door. It was Tuesday morning, the sort of morning where the sky is the color of an unwashed fleece and the air feels like it's made of damp wool. I sat huddled in my oversized jumper, the one my nan knitted that makes me look like a very depressed marshmallow, trying to decide if I had the mental fortitude to face double maths. Sienna arrived 5 minutes before the bell, looking remarkably composed for someone who had clearly just sprinted from the bus stop. She had a smear of cerulean blue paint on her left cheekbone, and her hair was tied back with a piece of string she'd probably found in the art block. She sat down next to me, dropping her bag with a thud that suggested she was carrying at least 3 boulders, or perhaps the complete works of Shakespeare. "I've had a revelation, Finn," she whispered, leaning in as if she were about to reveal the location of the Holy Grail rather than a thought she'd had while brushing her teeth. "Does it involve us leaving early to go to the bakery?" I asked hopefully. Because I feel like my soul is currently at 4% battery, and only a sausage roll can charge it. She shook her head, her eyes wide and sparkling with that terrifyingly bright optimism she wore like a shield. "No. Well, yes, maybe later. But the revelation is this: school isn't a prison. It's a simulation designed to test our ability to remain interesting while being bored to death. It's like a very long, very grey video game where the only power-up is a lukewarm cup of tea. I looked at the peeling posters on the wall, one about aiming high and another about UCAS deadlines, and sighed. If this is a simulation, the graphics are rubbish. Why didn't the developers give us dragons? Or at least chairs that don't make your spine feel like a slinky? Because, she said, tapping her nose, the challenge isn't surviving the dragons. It's surviving the silence of a mock exam. It's finding the beauty in a chipped mug. We're the heroes of the mundane, Finley. We're the protagonists of the ordinary. I liked that. It felt better than being the lad who forgets his calculator. We spent the next 10 minutes, the precious, stolen minutes before the bell, mapping out our mundane hero personas. Sienna decided her superpower would be the ability to find a silver lining in a thunderstorm, and I decided mine would be invisibility to authority figures, which mostly just involved me slouching so low in my seat that I became part of the furniture. Double maths was, as expected, a slow descent into madness. Mr. Henderson was talking about trigonometry, with the enthusiasm of a man reading a funeral oration for a goldfish. I stared out of the window, watching a single crow trying to balance on a TV aerial. It was a struggle. The crow would slip, flap its wings frantically, regain its dignity for a second, and then slip again. I nudged Sienna and pointed at the bird. She watched it for a moment, then tore a small scrap of paper from her notebook and scribbled something. She slid it across the desk. "That crow is my spirit animal," the note read. "He has no idea what he's doing, but he's doing it with such commitment." I laughed, a sharp, sudden sound that echoed in the silent classroom. Mr. Henderson stopped mid-equation, his chalk hovering over the board like a frozen lightning bolt. He turned slowly, his spectacles catching the fluorescent light. "Is there something about the sign rule that you find particularly hilarious, Finley?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. "No, sir," I said, trying to pull my invisibility superpower out of storage. I was just reflecting on the inherent irony of angles. How they try so hard to be right, yet most of the time they're just obtuse. The class went silent. Sienna buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. It was a classic Finley move, trying to be deep, and ending up sounding like a bargain bin philosopher with a head injury. Mr. Henderson stared at me for a long beat. "Obtuse, Finley. That is remarkably accurate for your current state of mind. Perhaps you could use some of that philosophical energy to solve question 4. I looked at question 4. It looked like a bunch of angry letters had decided to have a fight, with some numbers, and neither side was winning. I spent the rest of the lesson pretending to calculate the area of a triangle, while actually writing a poem about the crow on the aerial. When the bell finally released us, we tumbled out into the corridor like prisoners who had just been granted a surprise pardon. The inherent irony of angles. Sienna teased, bumping her shoulder against mine as we fought our way through the year 11s, who seemed to have grown 3 inches since yesterday, and were now moving in dense, aggressive packs. "That was your best work yet, Finn." "Truly. I think Mr. Henderson is still trying to process the sheer weight of your intellect." I panicked, I admitted, clutching my folder to my chest. My brain just threw out the first smart-sounding word it could find. It's a survival mechanism. If I sound vaguely intellectual, people might not notice I haven't done my homework since October. "It's okay," she said, her voice turning soft as we reached the sanctuary of the courtyard. "I think the world needs more people who find irony in angles. It's better than being someone who just sees the numbers and never the shapes." We sat on our usual bench, the one with Kev was here 2012 carved into the wood. The sun was making a brave attempt to break through the Somerset clouds, casting long, watery shadows across the flagstones. Do you ever feel, I started, poking at a loose thread on my jumper, like we're just waiting for life to start? Like this, the school, the buses, the lukewarm tea, is just the intro sequence and we're still stuck on the loading screen. Sienna looked up at the sky, her expression unreadable for a moment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, battered sketchbook. She flipped through the pages, showing me flashes of color, sketches of people at the bus stop, the canal at dusk, the messy pile of shoes by her front door. I used to think that, she said quietly. I used to think I was waiting to become an artist. Waiting to be good enough to start living. But then I realized that if I'm always waiting for the real part, I'm going to miss the bits that actually matter. The loading screen is the game. Finn. The bits in between the big moments. That's where the actual life happens. She handed me the sketchbook. On the latest page was a drawing of me. I was slouching at my desk, looking out the window, a tiny, poorly drawn crow perched on the corner of the frame. Underneath, she'd written, "The philosopher of the back row." It wasn't a perfect drawing. My nose was a bit too big and my hair looked like a startled hedgehog, but it was the kindest thing anyone had ever given me. It made me feel like I wasn't just a background character. I was a character in her story, and she was a character in mine. "Thanks, Sen," I said, my voice feeling a bit thick. I look surprisingly noble for someone who was thinking about Greg's at the time. "You have a very noble profile when you're daydreaming," she laughed. "It's very 19th century poet who died of a broken heart and a lack of vitamin D." We sat there for a while, the noise of the school fading into a distant hum. I realized then that Sienna was right. We weren't waiting for anything. We were already there. We were two kids in a small town in Somerset, surrounded by damp walls and difficult maths, but we were the ones looking at the light. We were the ones who knew that a digestive biscuit tasted better when shared, and that a crow on an aerial was more interesting than a sign rule. I pulled out my notebook, the one that usually held my entry 42 style observations. I didn't write a joke this time. I didn't try to be funny or mock philosophical. Entry 43, I wrote. Today I realized that the simulation is actually quite beautiful. Not because of the big things, but because of the blue paint on a friend's cheek and the way a crow refuses to fall off a roof. Maybe the point of being a background character is that you get the best view of the whole play. "What are you writing?" Sienna asked, leaning over. "Just a review of the graphics," I said, smiling at her. "I've decided to give them 5 stars. Even with the rain." She beamed, and for a second, the Somerset sun actually made it through the clouds, lighting up the courtyard and making the puddles look like spilled silver. We sat in the glow, two ordinary heroes, perfectly content with our loading screen. The bell for the end of the day didn't just ring, it exhaled. It was a long, rattling groan that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of the school's Victorian brickwork, signaling the temporary ceasefire between the students of St. Jude's and the curriculum. For a moment, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. We sat there, Sienna and I, still anchored to our weathered wooden bench, watching the exodus. The courtyard erupted. It was a frantic, technicolor blur of unbuttoned blazers, loosened ties, and the high-pitched shriek of freedom. Packets of crisps were sacrificed to the wind, and the heavy thud of trainers on flagstones created a rhythmic pulse that felt like the heart of the world beating just a little too fast. I watched them go, the strikers of the football team, the girls who spent lunch practicing TikTok dances in the alcoves, the prefects looking harried and over-caffeinated. They were all moving toward something. A bus, a job, a dinner, a future. Look at them, I whispered, resting my chin on my palm. The NPCs are departing for their scheduled resting animations. Sienna laughed, a bright, melodic sound that cut through the humidity. She was tucking her pencils back into a tin that once held high-end biscuits, but now housed a chaotic graveyard of charcoal nubs and eraser crumbs. And what about us, Finn? Are we just going to stay here until the janitor despawns us? I'm considering it, I said, squinting as a stray beam of light caught the edge of a puddle. I think I've reached a level of comfort with this bench that borders on the spiritual. I've memorized every scratch. I've even started to feel a strange, brotherly affection for Kev 2012. I wonder where Kev is now. I bet he's a CEO. Or a professional kite flyer. He's probably an accountant in Slough, Sienna countered, slinging her bag over her shoulder. But in his heart, he'll always be the king of the St. Jude's courtyard. Come on, Philosopher. My legs are going numb, and if I don't get a bag of chips soon, I might actually start eating my sketchbook. We stood up, our movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy around us. As we walked through the main gates, the air changed. The smell of floor wax and old textbooks was replaced by the scent of damp tarmac, wild garlic from the nearby hedgerows, and the distant, salty promise of the Bristol Channel. Somerset in the late afternoon was a peculiar kind of magic. The sky was a bruised purple, stitched together with golden threads where the sun refused to give up the ghost. We walked down the hill, past the chip shop that smelled like heaven and disappointment, and toward the canal where the water stayed as still as a mirror. Do you think we'll remember this? I asked suddenly, stopping by a rusted iron railing. Not the big stuff. Not the exams or the assemblies. But this specific walk. The way the light is hitting that Tesco trolley in the water. Sienna leaned over the rail, her eyes following a moorhen as it paddled through the reeds. I think those are the only things worth remembering, Finn. The big stuff is just the scaffolding. This, the trolley, the moorhen, the way your hair looks like you've been electrocuted by a very polite ghost, this is the actual building. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my notebook. The edges were frayed, and the cover was stained with what I hoped was tea, but suspected was mystery gravy from the canteen. I flipped to the very last page. I have one more, I said. Entry 44. The finale. Sienna moved closer, her shoulder brushing mine. The warmth of it felt grounding, a solid point in a world that often felt like it was made of pixels and mist. Go on then. Make it a good one. Something that would make Mr. Henderson weep with confusing pride. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs. I didn't think about being the kid at the back of the class. I didn't think about the grades I hadn't earned or the person I was supposed to become. I just thought about the silver light on the water and the girl standing next to me. Entry 44. I wrote, my handwriting more legible than usual. Today I decided that I don't want to win the game. I don't want to level up, or find the hidden treasure, or defeat the final boss. I just want to stay in the world. I want to be the person who notices the moss on the north side of the gym. I want to be the one who appreciates the sheer, unbridled ambition of a weed growing through concrete. Maybe the secret to a 5-star life isn't doing something legendary. Maybe it's just being here, in the middle of the Somerset damp, and realizing that even the loading screens are painted by a master. I closed the notebook with a soft thud. 5 stars? Sienna asked, a soft smile playing on her lips. 6, I corrected. 1 extra for the company. We started walking again, the shadows stretching out before us like long, dark capes. We weren't geniuses, and we weren't heroes. We were just 2 teenagers in a small town, carrying bags filled with unfinished homework and big, messy dreams. But as we turned the corner and the town lights began to flicker on like fallen stars, I realized that we were exactly where we needed to be. The simulation was glitchy, the graphics were moody, and the plot was entirely non-linear. But as Sienna started telling me a ridiculous story about a cow she'd seen that looked like Boris Johnson, I knew one thing for certain. The game was beautiful. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next level. I was perfectly happy right here, on the loading screen, watching the sun go down over the Mendips. "Race you to the bridge," Sienna challenged, already stepping off the curb. "You'll lose," I shouted back, my spirits lifting higher than any crow on a chimney stack. "I have the power of pseudo-philosophy on my side. And I have better shoes," she yelled over her shoulder, already running. I laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt like it could shatter the clouds, and ran after her. Behind us, the school was a dark silhouette against the fading light, a place of rules and rows. But ahead of us was everything else. The night, the town, and the infinite, glorious, unscripted mess of being alive. It was a brilliant ending. Or, perhaps, just a really, really good beginning.